Dr. James Dunn is a cognitive psychologist at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. He is interested in the cognitive and perceptual processes that underlie face recognition and expertise, specifically the traits of so-called superrecognizers. He's been part of a group of researchers that developed a widely acclaimed test that helps identify the world's best performing superrecognizers. And we are delighted to have him join us here today at the House of Beautiful Business to tell us more about his research. All right. Hey, James. Thanks so much for joining us from Sydney.
Thanks for having me.
So what is a superrecognizer in layman's terms?
In layman's terms, a superrecognizer is just what we would call the top 1% of the population in face recognition ability. They can remember faces much more accurately than the average person, often after many years or after a very short encounter.
And you just developed a test that has gotten a lot of media coverage, widely considered a breakthrough test in the field of superrecognizer research. What makes your test different from previous tests? Why is it so significant?
Yep. So there have been a few tests being used to identify face recognition ability in the past. The problem is with those tests that superrecognizers will quite often score 100% performance or quite close to that. And so we identified a need to give them a test that really challenged the full extent of their ability, because we really didn't know what are the limits of these superrecognizers, just how good can they be. So we were set about to design the first test that was deliberately calibrated to be difficult for even a superrecognizer. And based on the results so far, I think we've succeeded.
The extreme opposite of super recognition or super recognizing is face blindness, right? So some people have a really hard time recognizing other people's faces, which is why we have name tags and other cues for people to stand out in large offices or among crowds. Can you talk a little bit about face blindness and how many people, if you look at the overall population, are face blind versus being super recognizers, the 1%?
Yeah, prosopagnosia we know is a rare disorder, affects about 1 to 2% of the population. And most of those cases that we're aware of, this is referring to congenital or developmental prosopagnosia, people who have it from birth. And really critical for these people, there's not any known brain damage, structural damage. It doesn't appear to be caused by them lacking a particular part of the brain or something like that. It just seems like it's a weakness, something that they've just missing in their development, or we're not really sure exactly what the cause is, but it's about 1 to 2% of the population. There are, of course, people who acquire prosopagnosia from a stroke or some other brain damage. But in terms of that people who just are born that way, we're talking about 1 to 2% of the population.
And for super recognizers, true, right? That is a genetically inherited ability, or can one train to become a super recognizer?
Yeah, what we see with super recognizers is that it's highly heritable amongst family members. So in previous research looking at twins, we generally found that it was passed between identical twins quite frequently. So that gives us the idea that it was likely to be a genetic component. And in our lab research as well, we've started looking at training people to become not necessarily super recognizers, but to improve their ability in general. And we found we can improve people's ability on a test, maybe from 2 to 5%. But that is quite a significant shortfall from where super recognizers are scoring maybe 20, 30% better than the average person on those tests. So although we can train you a little bit, it seems largely genetic based, what determines how well you do and hard coded into your DNA.
So let's imagine for a second that everybody wore face masks. It's not an entirely impossible scenario, I guess, this year. Would super recognizers still be able to super recognize? In other words, how many parts of a face do need to be visible for a super recognizer to super recognize? And are there insights that you have into which parts of a face actually help a super recognizer super recognize?
So to say generally, there's still a lot we don't know about what super recognizers are doing that makes them so good. We've just started scratching the surface on this area. And some of the early results that we've had is that we haven't really found any systematic patterns across different super recognizers. That is to say, they don't always have the same strategy across different people. But not only that, one super recognizer will employ different strategies depending on what face they're looking at. And when I say strategies, I mean what features they're attending to. So we think they're a little bit more in tune to what might be a diagnostic feature in someone's face. So for example, someone who has a very distinguished nose or very distinct ears, they seem to pay a little more attention to those features than what otherwise we see from other people. So they just seem to be tuning into those. And because of that reason, we think they are quite good at recognizing at a featural level. So the idea of the mask, would they be better? They would be somewhat impaired depending on what that person's diagnostic feature was, but they would probably be better than the average person still. Maybe not super in the same way they normally are, but what we do find is under restricted conditions, they are very, very good. We've seen that when they look at faces at a very short interval, say 2 seconds, we've started seeing then they're remembering faces much more accurately than the average person. We're also seeing if you only provide just one region of the face or feature, they seem to also be more accurate at recognizing the face under those conditions as well.
Let's look at facial recognition technology enabled by artificial intelligence, which has gotten a lot of media coverage as well in recent years. How does it compare to human super recognizer abilities? And to what extent does the cognitive process differ between, AI facial recognition and a human super recognizer?
Well, there's actually something a lot in common between algorithms and how they're developed and the human brain. The most modern face recognition technologies are built on neural networks that are built on simplified versions of the architecture of the brain and neural pathways. So we know that they're going to have some similarity in that way. But just like super recognizers, they're a little bit of a black box. We know we can test their performance. We don't know exactly what we're doing. So explainable AI has become an important part of research to try and develop the idea of what are they doing that makes them so good. In terms of differences between algorithms and super recognizers, algorithms we know can be very, very accurate under controlled conditions. So if you're trying to recognize somebody with a smart gate technology at the border, where you have a highly standardized photo, you have somebody standing, you know exactly how far they're standing from the camera, you're taking away glasses, you're removing expression, you're fixing all those conditions, we know they're going to be very, very accurate on those conditions. But we also know that if the computer can't do it, it's going to get sent to the human. So it's also becoming a very important human task as well, because if it's difficult for the computer, the human operator is going to have the final say. In terms of what super recognizers are doing, super recognizers seem to be able to recognize a face even in those challenging conditions that currently an algorithm is not so good at. So your face in the wild, what we call it in the facial recognition software research. But the idea of when you have unconstrained view of the face, CCTV cameras are placed in the corner of the room, not always the best lighting condition, obscured, those kind of things. Super recognizers we expect, and what we have found in tests is that they will do better on those conditions than an algorithm will.
Interesting. And outperforming AI in terms of super recognition. That raises the question of the professional life of a super recognizer. So you've met several super recognizers, or numerous super recognizers, I suppose. What are the professions, or how does it influence their selection of profession? You would imagine, for example, that many of them end up being spies or agents working for the intelligence community or other professional tracks. So like what does their professional life look like, and is it impacted by their ability to super recognize?
So speaking in general, we know that some police agencies and government organizations have begun recruiting and selecting people based on face recognition ability. I say recruiting, it's been mostly selection. They've been mostly looking at people who are already employed in their staff and then selecting them based on their ability. There's been some quite famous cases. For example, Scotland Yard, the London Metropolitan Police Force, they had a super recognizer unit that was very critical in their response to the 2011 riots and identifying a lot of the people who participated in that. So it's been quite useful in that way. But we know, just speaking to these super recognizers, we're just as likely to find them in roles that benefit from their super recognizing ability as we are not to. We see some of these people find it quite useful in their day-to-day interactions with clients, just building that interaction, that social aspect to engaging with people. But then we also know that sometimes they're also likely to be an accountant or an engineer, where it's just maybe not so important that you recognize the person you're talking to. So a lot of them don't realize they have this ability in the first place, so it doesn't really drive their career choices. But if they are good at faces, sometimes they do find, yeah, it could be quite useful.
Now, there's also something interesting about your research. You found that super recognizers tend to conceal their ability to super recognize because they appear to be worried that they might be perceived as stalkers, right? Or this is kind of like a superpower that puts them in a superior position when they interact socially. Tell me more about that. This tendency to conceal their ability to super recognize.
Yeah, we've had quite a few anecdotes from meeting and talking with super recognizers of instances where they've had to lie to somebody else because they don't want to come across as maybe creepy or a stalker. And this has actually become a little more common for them, especially in the social media age, where it's quite common for you to see photos of people well before you actually meet them in person. And in that way, that casual acquaintance, they just have a better memory of those people. And people find it quite peculiar when you're able to say, hey, I remember you. You're in that grocery store line behind me 3 days ago. People think you're a little bit of a stalker or a creepy kind of person to pay that much attention to it. I can give a little short story of a particular case of somebody who demonstrated this. A super recognizer I met named Georgie was in Paris, just minding her own business, sitting in a park, when she observed the photographer who was doing a photo shoot with some children in the park. Didn't really pay much attention to it, maybe watched them go about their business for about 5 minutes. But about 10 years later, in a backpackers hotel in Byron Bay in Australia, she recognized that same photographer there. And she went up to him and she said, hey, are you a photographer by chance? And he said, yes. And she goes, well, do you take photos of children? And he said, yes, I do. It's like, well, do you happen to be in Paris 10 years ago doing a photo shoot? I think I recognize you from. And he's like, oh my God, yes. And was able to show her on his phone, his portfolio of the photos that he had taken that day. Meanwhile, the awkward side of it was that his girlfriend was there with him and thought this woman was an absolute lunatic for recognizing her boyfriend or partner at the time. Just from this casual acquaintance, just really thought she'd been stalking him for quite some time.
Wow. Sorry. And it does raise some ethical questions, of course. So on the flip side, right? So if super recognizers want to conceal their ability, on the flip side, you could also argue that they might have an obligation to actually identify themselves as super recognizers so that people are aware of their superpowers. What would you advise? What's your ethical advice on that issue?
I mean, for me personally, the way you see people in your day to day, it's in public places. You're not invading their privacy. In the same way, you might remember a conversation that you overheard and might retell it to your friend. That them recognizing that person's face is probably as much as an invasion of privacy as that. So the idea of declaring that you're a super recognizer, I think not everyone will know what that means and kind of comprehend it anyway, but it would be quite humorous if they have to come up to people and go, hey, I'm a super recognizer, and for that reason, I remember you from... some of them do conceal their ability, but actually more often than not, they're very proud of it as well. It's become part of their identity. They're able to go out and say, hey, I recognize people really well. I just find people so interesting and engaging. They become the go-to recognizer in their family. You watching a movie, oh, where do we know that person from? Or where do we know that person? They went to our school, didn't they? Oh yeah, they were this person. They were this many years below us or something like that. So they're actually can be quite proud of their abilities as well. And it's a cool party trick at the very least.
Are you a super recognizer?
Unfortunately not. I'm in the what I call the Hall of Very Good. So I'm above average, but not a super recognizer.
So what made you become interested in this topic? I mean, it seems to be such a particular area of research how did you get into this field of study?
Yeah, I took a position as a research assistant with my colleagues and supervisor, Dr. David White and Professor Richard Kemp here at University of New South Wales. And at the time, they were just starting to do a project working with the Australian Passport Office, who were trying to develop systems and methodology and training protocols to improve their staff's face recognition ability. And as part of that, we published some of the first research showing that passport officers, despite their training and experience, weren't necessarily better than the average person. And part of that was because we found that experience didn't just generally improve people's ability automatically, and that training, because it wasn't evidence-based, didn't also guarantee improvements in ability. So that was some of the early work in about 2014, and we've been working on that project since. But one of the things that became quite clear, if training and experience aren't going to work, is that you may be able to select people based on aptitude, because we were aware at the time that face recognition ability was quite stable. So you could test someone now and test them in a week's time, and you expect basically the same result both times. So if that's true and you got these large individual differences, so some people just being naturally good, we thought the best process to try and actually improve their recognition accuracy as a system and as a staff is to actually select people for these specialized roles. This actually was some work that we did for quite some time before we even really paid much attention to super recognizers. And it's when we started realizing, hey, there are these super excellent people as well, that maybe we should be starting to look at these people as part of that as well.
Last question for you, James.
Okay.
Your research and your test has gotten a lot of media coverage in mainstream media in recent weeks, ever since you published the results. What's the next frontier of your research? What keeps you excited? What's still to explore?
Yeah, what keeps me excited is that there's still so much we don't know about super recognizers and face recognition in general. We don't really know how we get to become experts as a human, because in a lot of ways we are naturally experts at recognizing faces. The people that we are familiar with, our friends and family, we are very good at recognizing those people, except for, of course, if you got that prosopagnosia. We're very good at that. And so we don't really know how we become familiar with a person, what happens when that happens, and then at the next level, what are super recognizers doing that makes them so special? So there's so many unanswered questions. And so what we're doing with this test is now we're getting opportunities to meet new super recognizers, get their opinions, get their thoughts on how they think this ability has affected them, how they think they come to recognizing faces, and really dive into the cognitive and perceptual drivers of this ability. So we've identified all these people, and so many people have engaged with our tests, which has been amazing. We've started giving out online tests. We've been testing people in our lab with eye tracking technology to really develop our understanding of what makes these people so good. And hopefully we can learn a little bit about this idea of expertise in general.
James, thanks very much. Good luck with your
Thank
future
you.